So today I want to start off and just talk about cowboys, Renaissance men, and geniuses. And it's interesting that kind of in our culture, in our society, we really sort of treasure and celebrate this idea of the Lone Ranger, the Renaissance man. This is a sketch from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. And he was, again, that quintessential Renaissance man that mastered all of these different forms of, science, arts, architecture, and has kind of become a hero in our minds, or at least mine. We also think of Albert Einstein, and then a little more recently, I think of Steve Jobs in this category, someone who was really driven by obsession to make a dent in the universe. And so we look at all these people as sort of singular moments of genius. And in a similar way, we kind of think about that with how ideas form. We think of the light bulb, the eureka moment, where suddenly all these disparate forms of information in your mind suddenly align to form an idea. So whereas you kind of have these singular geniuses, we also think about creativity and innovation as kind of happening in these singular moments. And I kind of think of that as sort of a past way of thinking. There's no saying or no denying that Einstein was a genius. That's obvious. But I think with some of the problems that we're facing in the future, some of the challenges, just how complex things have gotten, some of the just systemic issues that we face, it really requires kind of a different protagonist, a different hero. And that I really see as community. I see us as kind of moving beyond this singular genius and moving towards collective genius. How do we, in the same way that the brain networks and sort of organizes ideas, how do we create global networks that can sort of recreate that and really bubble up a global genius? And for me, the idea of community really fuels innovation, fuels ideas in three ways. First of all, it catalyzes the creative process. Second, it really has a built-in mechanism for the rapid adoption of new ideas. And third, it actually helps sustain change. It helps us build new habits that otherwise, we might falter on and just sort of go back to our normal ways. And so I'll talk about the first one, which is really catalyzing the creative process and how communities do that. And we've all kind of experienced this where you have writer's block or you're doing anything and kind of hit this point where you're stuck. And you ask a friend, you ask a family member, and they don't give you the answer, but they immediately inject a new perspective that sort of reorganizes how you think about something and drives you forward. So that's kind of the most basic example. One of my all-time favorite examples kind of on a larger scale is called Fold It. And Fold It is basically a game that lets people fold proteins online. Yeah, who would have thought? But it basically came out of a researcher's problem. So they were working on protein folding and how that relates to AIDS, and realized that computers really weren't good at some of the more intuitive calculations that needed to happen. They weren't very good at spatial reasoning. So they decided to basically create a game out of it. Let's create puzzles for people online and let them solve it and compete with each other and also collaborate with each other to kind of map these new proteins. And actually within the first 3 weeks of this launching, the community had basically mapped the structure of a protein that was involved in sort of the reproduction of the HIV virus that scientists had been working on for over a decade. And since then, they've actually published 4 papers in Nature on different proteins that this community has found. So it's really, really amazing how communities can really catalyze that creative process, because there's really rapid iteration of ideas. Everyone's injecting new perspective, and so we can move a lot quicker when the community is involved. Second, I'll talk about how communities can really basically, again, catalyze the adoption of new ideas. So we can have the best idea in the world, but if people don't adopt it, it's sort of useless. So it's actually in the airport about a month ago, and my brother recommended this book to me, so I picked it up. And the first chapter was about an epidemic in hospitals. It was talking about how 2 million people a year leave hospitals with infections that were avoidable. And over 90,000 people a year actually die from those infections. And this has been something that's plagued hospitals since the 1800s and really forever. And no one's really been able to solve it. There's all sorts of technologies, moving from hand washing to Purell, but we still struggle with this issue. And it really comes down to people not washing their hands. It's that simple. And what I thought was interesting is Atul Gawande, the author of this book, talks about one hospital that actually made this work and made a big difference. And this hospital decided, instead of just bringing outside ideas in and pushing them through, we're actually going to involve the community. So they formed 30-minute groups every week that involved all of the different practitioners in the hospital. So everything from janitors to cooks to doctors to surgeons, and actually involved them in coming up with ideas for how to solve this problem. They basically said the stats of where their hospital was at. People came up with ideas, and then it was up to them to go kind of launch them, and the hospital would sponsor their activities. And what was amazing is after they implemented this process, within a year, their MRSA rate was down to 0. And there was no breakthrough technology, there was no breakthrough innovation that came out of these groups, but the hospital involved the community in coming up with the ideas and then shared the data back to them of, we're doing better, we're doing worse. So everyone became responsible for implementing those ideas, and so they were adopted much, much quicker. The final thing that I think is really amazing about communities is how they can really help us change behavior, which is a really, really difficult thing to do. And one of the great examples, I think, is Nike Plus. Nike actually basically built a community around their products. So instead of just going for a run, you can now go for a run and bring your friends with you. They can give you kudos along the way. You can see your stats about how you're improving over time. So all this data, all this community really helps you not just go for a run, but go for a run surrounded by motivation. Another example of this is my brother's Facebook page. I find this hilarious, but a couple of months ago he was talking to me about how he was basically having trouble kind of staying in an active state. He is an MD, PhD, he has absolutely no time. He's the most motivated person I've ever met in my life, but he was still having trouble going to the gym, working out regularly, but he knew that was absolutely essential to, having a sharp mind. And then he told me that he joined this 5 a.m. workout group, which just sounded insane. And I asked him, why would you do that? And he said, if my alarm goes off at 4:30 and it's only up to me, I'm going to hit the snooze button. But if my alarm goes off at 4:30 and I know there's a community waiting for me that's going to notice if I'm not there, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to go. A couple days later, this posted on his Facebook page. Someone from the class actually said, 5 a.m.'s been a little empty without you the last 2 days. And some people started commenting on that, and then my brother leaps in with an excuse. So it just goes to show, people notice when you're not there, and that's one of the great things about community and how they can help sort of motivate long-term change. The problem is there's a really fine line between a crowd and a community. And so I just wanted to share a couple thoughts about how kind of we think about community and how we can promote community. And a lot of these are going to probably seem mind-numbingly simple, but it's amazing to me how often we get them wrong. So the first one is basically creating an infrastructure for meaningful conversation. This is such a great example of that, just TED in general, bringing together people who would never otherwise meet and letting them have a conversation. I think it's such a cool example. And a lot of times we forget to do this, on a global level, obviously, because it's very difficult to create those forums, but then even on a very, very micro level. So one of the things I'm amazed about is how few families actually eat dinner together. So when we think about meaningful conversation, that can just be the dinner table. And there was actually a study released that showed that students or kids who ate dinner with their parents on a regular basis were 40% more likely to have A's and B's in school and not be, as connected with drugs, alcohol, and that sort of stuff. So, again, creating that infrastructure for meaningful conversation is really the groundwork, the foundation, and we forget to do that a lot. The second element is just listening. We work with a lot of brands that are kind of creating communities around their products, and it's amazing how many form communities but then forget to actually listen. They form these communities, and then even through Facebook, other mediums, they just start pushing their messaging, and they forget to listen. And so I think, listening and letting the community know that you're listening is an essential ingredient. Also, curation, I think, is a really important part. In the hospital example, if they told all these employees just go out and implement solutions and then there was no follow-up, I think it would have ended up in a disaster. But because they kept up with it, they curated the ideas, gave feedback to the community about what was working, what wasn't. Having that organization, those community managers sort of managing the conversation really helped to promote and actually create success with that community. I don't know if you guys can see this, but it kind of looks like fireworks. It's actually a visualization of a social network. It's easy to comprehend networks and communities when they're, just Fort Collins or sort of our family. But when they get complex, they get really complex. And so we start to inject technology to help moderate all that and to help sort of structure these conversations. And people end up becoming these little nodes on these charts and connections. And I think a lot of people start to see kind of technology as the answer. How do we automate this community? How do we pull humans out of it? But we really have to remember that humans and communities are built up of humans. And so all the kind of rules of psychology, all of that applies. And so we have to get back to basics and realize that technology can be a catalyst and can be a help, but in the end, it comes down to people. And that's really what can fuel communities. So thank you very much.